Hi, I'm Dr. Lyndon Walker. The following video here on YouTube is a compilation of the segments from my Skillshare course on completing an ethics application. So you can watch through here on YouTube. You can also click the link below the video if you want to work through it on Skillshare. Skillshare often will offer 7 and 14 day premium memberships, which will allow you to access the course on Skillshare for free. If not, feel free to stay on YouTube and watch it here. Main difference is that there is an ethics project at the end of the course in Skillshare. Other than that, all of the key information is here for you on YouTube. Hopefully you find it valuable and enjoy it. Hi, I'm Dr. Lyndon Walker. I'm a former academic who now makes YouTube videos and resources to help research students. During my time as an academic, I was an ethics advisor and sat on a number of ethics committees. So this is an area that I'm quite knowledgeable and particularly passionate about. Today we are going to be looking at how to complete an ethics application. So anyone who is doing any kind of human research is generally going to need an ethics application before they start collecting their data. In America, this is often called an Institutional Review Board, or IRB. In Europe and Australasia, more commonly called an ethics committee. So today we are going to be looking at when and why you will need to do an ethics application. And then I'm going to work through a number of tips of how to do it. So each different university and each different jurisdiction, it's going to be a little bit different. But what I'm going to look at is some key principles and key pieces of information that are pretty much universal. So wherever you are applying for your ethics application, there's going to be some very similar things that they're expecting to see. For most of you, if you are a master's or PhD student, you'll be applying to an internal board, so normally at your university. There are situations where you may be doing very high-level medical research, where you may need to apply to a health department or government body. And for people who are out in the commercial world, there are commercial ethics boards that will look at research. And so this could be if you're working in a commercial enterprise, but you're doing some research that you would like to publish as research, not just as a commercial activity. I will give you some tips on how to speed up your application. And then if you are watching this on Skillshare, we will look at an ethics project. I hope this is going to be very valuable for you. It certainly can be quite a stressful time doing an ethics application if you've never done one before. So I will be aiming to give you as many good tips as I possibly can. Okay, so let's have a look at when you are going to need to get ethics approval for your research. So the very broad answer is basically any time that you're going to have human participants. So if we take a look at some examples, and so you can see here's quite a list of different things. If you're in the social sciences or business, then quite commonly it will be things like questionnaires and focus groups. If you're in the medical domain, then it could be clinical trials. It could involve taking things like blood samples or other tissues and fluids. It could be, say, in sports science, where there's some sort of treatment or exercise protocol that you're doing with people. It could be things to do with genes. So it's going to be very, very common for medical research to have a slightly higher bar because there's going to be something that's perhaps a little bit more invasive. For some social scientists work where you're perhaps just doing a questionnaire, then you'll still need to get ethics approval, but it won't be quite as much work for you because you really will just need to justify why you're doing the questionnaire, what's going to be in it. If it's sensitive issues, there might be a few other things to look at. One area above and beyond kind of the things that we would immediately think of for human research is where you're using other personal information. So it could be that you're accessing data possibly by some third party, and that data is not public, and so there may be privacy implications and ethical implications. There may also be a cultural element to your research, so perhaps you're doing something with Indigenous peoples or with groups where there is an additional ethical dimension above and beyond just collecting data as you normally would. So if we have a look at some exceptions, so one of the exceptions is if it's public domain archival data. So there is data that gets collected and it's just put out there for the public to use. Just because data is public, that is not the only requirement for being exempt from an ethics application. You should look at the terms and conditions for the data and also what the requirements are for your particular ethics body. But it can often be that public data is something that you can use without having to go through ethics. The next is data that's collected for reasons other than research. So perhaps you're teaching and you are doing a survey of your students. You might be doing student feedback and quality. It could be some sort of quality assurance or audit type work. If this is not being used for research, then it doesn't need ethics approval. What's really important to remember here though is that later on, if you wanted to use it for research ethics, it could be challenging if you collected it without first getting the ethics approval. So that's something really important to think about is I'm going to be collecting some data. Maybe it's not research data right now. Would I want it to be in the future? The next is where you may have some blanket approval already. So commonly this happens for low-risk research for perhaps an honours or a master's program, where the leader or the lecturer has already actually sought and gained ethics approval for the whole class, and then they will have some steps that you as a student need to take, but you won't need to do your own ethics approval beyond what you're doing in class because they've already done it collectively for the group. So as I was saying before, really important to remember that retrospective approval is really difficult to get. So if you are going to be collecting data, you really need to think, could this have a research implication in the future? If so, maybe just to be safe, I will do an ethics application now. So this is when we need to do an ethics form. What about why? So really the first point is a moral obligation. So we're going to be collecting data, we're going to be invading people's privacy potentially, we're taking information off them. There's a moral obligation for us to ensure that we're conducting our research ethically. It also adds credibility to our research. It's kind of like a peer review before we start. So with that peer review, it's checking that the ethical dimensions of our research, and encapsulated within that, the quality of the research is adequate for what we are doing. The next is legal and liability. So depending on what country you are in, there will be different legal requirements around research. In Australia, for instance, there is a national code. So any human research is governed by this, and this includes the requirement for ethics applications. From a liability perspective, if you are doing research and you are not covered by ethics, then this can have some very serious insurance implications if something were to go wrong. So some of the consequences if we didn't get our ethics approval before we started. One is that in that case of the insurance, you could be personally liable. If you were expected to get ethics approval, you chose not to, perhaps you're doing some sports science research and you did something that actually did some damage to someone, they decided to sue, you are the one that is in the wrong through not first getting that ethics approval, so you could become personally liable. Most educational institutions have rules regarding ethics where they can choose not to give you your dissertation or your thesis. So they can actually say, well, you didn't get your ethics, this was not done properly, we will not grant you your degree. It's also very common for journals to not publish research if you cannot demonstrate that you had ethics approval before you collected your data. And there's a reputational impact as well. If you start to gain a reputation as being a bit of a cowboy, of doing research, not thinking about consequences, people are not going to want to work with you, institutions going to not want to hire you, and there's been some pretty famous cases over the years where people have done research without ethics and they just had to leave academia, leave research because no one would work with them anymore. So really the big message here is be very proactive, gain your approval. Your approval must be gained before you start your data collection. So you can't collect a little bit of data then do ethics. The ethics has to come before you collect any data whatsoever. Okay, in this section we are going to look at how to apply for ethics approval, including some of the critical items that you will need to be including in your application. So this is where it's going to vary depending on your institution and your country, and it's also going to depend on what type of research. But there are going to be some critical items that are going to come up pretty much no matter what, and so I'm going to try and detail some of those. So the application generally goes to a committee. There's most certainly going to be the completion of some forms and the submission of research materials. So your research materials could be surveys and questionnaires, certainly consent and information forms. So what information are you providing to your participants? And then in the case of if you're administering drugs or you're doing anything like that, all of the information about those. There is typically going to be signatures, the very least kind of your manager or supervisor. If you are engaging third-party institutions, then permission to do research at those institutions may also be required. In some cases you may be required to appear before the committee, but this is very dependent on what kind of research and what kind of committee. For your standard university committee, this is quite unusual. You will normally, though, have to respond to committee questions and concerns. So your application will go to a committee, it will be given to some people to review, it'll be a blind review typically, and you via the committee will receive a set of questions and concerns for you to address. So they may sometimes have suggestions, they may sometimes ask for additional information, perhaps it could be something like you're doing psychological research, and how are you going to protect the participants? So maybe you will need to have contact details for counselling services if someone were to perhaps from your questionnaire be triggered by something and need some help and support. So some of the items that you'll typically address in these applications, so describing and justifying your study, and this is a little bit like your research proposal. The data collection and storage, so what are you collecting, how are you collecting it, how are you going to store it and protect it. You need to identify and address ethical issues, and this is a pretty big thing. This is going to be in the next section or the next video, and then the analysis and dissemination. So once you've taken the data, what exactly are you going to do with it? Throughout, you're going to need to demonstrate principles of ethically sound research. So am I not only identifying those ethical issues, but making sure that I am addressing them? And then any relevant laws and regulations as well. And this will vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So if we look at the principles of ethically sound research, different countries and different universities may have different variations of this in terms of sets of explicit principles, but all of these ideas that we're going to be looking at are pretty much universal. The first and probably the biggest is the informed and voluntary consent. So your research participants should know what they're getting themselves into, and they should be able to consent to be a participant in a voluntary way. So there shouldn't be any pressure or coercion, there shouldn't be some sort of dynamic where they feel obligated to be in the research. So they know what's going on, and they are of their own free will. They need to be of kind of age and capacity to make that decision for themselves, and then they need to be able to consent. It's going to be important that it doesn't breach privacy. Every country has its own set of privacy laws, and so you'll need to ensure that you comply with those. In general, though, this is going to be not making the person identifiable, not releasing their data to the public, and really just protecting the information that you're collecting from them. We want to minimize any physical or emotional harm. So note that I said minimize. Generally, we don't want to have any, but it is the case, for instance, if we are doing some sort of medical testing where there could be a little bit of physical discomfort. It could be if we're doing psychological research, that some of the questions you could be asking about sensitive topics, it could be challenging for people. But when this occurs, this is where we need to be able to very much justify that it is required. So my research is important for these reasons. We're going to minimize these harms, but if they are to occur, here's how we'll address them. Here's why this is still important for us to find these things out in my research. We need to keep in mind cultural and social sensitivity. So am I working with vulnerable groups? Am I working with other cultures? Am I working with indigenous peoples? Is there particular language and protocols and things that I need to keep in mind? If these are groups that are foreign to you, or even if they're not, it's really important to get advice on this. So in your university or your institution, hopefully there will be people that you can call on who have expertise in this area and can guide you on what is appropriate and not appropriate. We want to limit deception. So in the case of blind studies, where we may have cases and controls, or we may have treatments, there may be some amount of we are perhaps double-blinded, perhaps we are administering a treatment, we don't know if you're getting the sugar pill or not. But we want to limit deception. So in the case of experimental design, there may be reason for it, but we shouldn't be deceiving participants just for our own ends. We need to make sure we respect any intellectual property and also cultural property as well. So that ties back to that cultural sensitivity. It's really important that we look for any conflicts of interest. If I'm doing some research and perhaps I have a co-researcher or myself, I'm somehow linked or could benefit from a particular research outcome, then that could be quite problematic. So I need to look for conflicts of interest of myself with the research, with the funding. If there are funders, perhaps they may have a particular agenda or a particular outcome they're after. And this can be actual conflicts of interest, but it can also just be perceived conflicts of interest, as these can still be problematic for your research. The committee is going to be looking for adequate research design. So ethically sound research is also good quality research. If you're doing bad research, if you are doing analysis or collecting data or trying to answer questions in ways that's just not possible, if it's sloppy or poorly designed, this is unethical. So our ethical research is also good research. And a good research ethics committee will actually give you helpful feedback that will help improve your research. Okay, so let's look in a little bit more depth. So describing and justifying your research, this is hopefully something that's going to be quite straightforward because it's something you will have already done in your research proposal. So why are you conducting this study? Why is this research important? Really just that defense of what you're doing. From there, how are you going to collect your participants? It's really important that this is nice and clear. Where are you going to get them from? Is it going to be invites on social media? Is there going to be flyers? Is it going to be something with direct invitation? Are people going to be able to say no to this? So the wording of your invites is very important. You shouldn't presume that people are going to say yes. So it should be a very neutral wording of, here is this research, would you participate, as opposed to thank you for participating when in fact they haven't said yes yet. And what we're trying to do here is we are really making clear that there's not a bias in the collection, there's no pressuring of participants, and there's good clear communication so the participants know what they're getting themselves into. You need to demonstrate your participant consent process. So for a lot of research, there will be an information sheet making it clear what the participant is going to, their involvement. There'll be a consent form. So the consent form is normally a signed form if it's something like an interview or a clinical trial or a focus group. If it's a questionnaire and it's an anonymous questionnaire, then you may have what's called implied consent. So you'll still provide the information, but after the person clicks start the survey, they have implied that they have consented to do the survey. For most research, there's an expectation that a participant can drop out at any time. The exact phrasing of this may vary a little bit from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And there can be challenges for this. So if someone does an anonymous questionnaire, well, it was anonymous. I don't know which one is theirs to be able to remove it in general. But for someone, maybe they're partway through an interview, partway through a clinical trial, in general, they should have the opportunity to change their mind and be able to drop out at any point. You need to be able to describe how your data is going to be collected and what's it going to look like. Is it going to be anonymous? Is it going to be confidential? Or is there a possibility that participants will be identifiable? If they are identifiable, will they know that? Will they be okay with that? Can you defend that? Is it required that someone needs to be identifiable? And identifiable doesn't necessarily just mean their name. Identifiable can be just a set of demographics and characteristics. Perhaps we are referring to a female CEO of a company that's worth $600 million listed in a particular country, and by the process of elimination, that's only one person. Even sometimes where it's a small group, a little bit of deduction can help us work out who people are. So really important to think about things like this. Am I going to be actually identifying people? Sometimes with questionnaires, it's nice and easy. It'll be anonymous. If I make sure that I'm not asking too many characteristics that will make people identifiable, then it's going to be very simple. With my analysis, if I'm going to be doing quantitative analysis, I want to be able to justify my sample size. So if there's any quantitative analysis, there should be a sample size and power calculations to show how many people we are wanting to collect in our study. For qualitative, we still want to say what our target sample size is, and with some sort of justification. Perhaps it's 10 interviews, perhaps it's 3 focus groups that each have 5 people. You want to be able to say, I'm collecting this many people, and have a justification for it. You also want to have a statement about what happens if you don't reach that sample size. Generally, you will just proceed, particularly if you're doing an honours or a master's. Perhaps we needed 300 people in our survey and we got 250. Well, that's probably okay. If we needed 300 people and we got 10, well, we probably have to go back to the drawing board. We may need to resubmit an ethics application or submit an addendum or an adjustment to it to say, well, actually we're going to do something else now. But good to comment, what's going to happen if I don't reach that sample size that I've said I want? How am I going to store the data? So we're going to need password protected files and computers. If there is physical material, then locked filing cabinets, locked rooms, describing the location, and what's going to happen to this data over time. So in many countries there are requirements that you keep your research data for a certain number of years, and so you should explicitly state this firstly in your information sheet for the participants, also in your ethics application. And then what's going to happen after that? Sometimes people want to keep data for longer, put it in research archives and things like that. In other cases, it will be destroyed. If you're going to destroy it, is it going to be securely deleted? How are you going to go about this? So stating all of these things for the ethics committee so they know that you've thought about it. If we think about the analysis, we should describe as an applicant what the analysis is going to look like. This helps for the committee to determine that it's ethically sound in the sense of being quality research. So if we're doing research and we're wasting participant time, this is unethical. So ethical research, good research is ethical research. Again, thinking about the analysis, when we do the analysis, the participant's going to be identifiable. Should we only be providing summary statistics and not any particular pieces in our dissemination? And where are we going to disseminate? So where will we publish this research? Is it just going into a thesis? There are instances where you may be doing something where it may be a thesis that is securely stored and there is no public access. But are you going to go to conferences? Are you going to present in a conference, write a white paper, write a journal? Are you going to present other places? Where is the outcomes of this research going to be presented? Generally, this is just good to be clear for the committee. Sometimes there could be ethical implications if there is sensitive topics or identifiable characteristics. Okay, in our next section, we will look at some of the potential ethical issues that could arise and that you'll need to be able to discuss how you will deal with in your application. In this section, we are going to look at some of the common ethical issues that can come up in research. This is certainly not an exhaustive list, but hopefully it will just give you some things to think about that may come up in your research. The first is having children as subjects. So it's vital that we have an informed consent process, and if you have children as participants, you definitely also need their parents to consent. If you are collecting data from an institution, so for instance a childcare or a school, you'll also need that institutional consent as well. We should always be thinking about issues of power. So is your relationship as the researcher to the participant, or whoever is inviting the participant, do they have some sort of power relationship? So it could be doctor and patient, it could be principal and teacher, it could be teacher and student. It could be you with friends and family. So generally the advice is don't try and invite friends and family, because there is a dynamic there. They may feel obligated and pressured. And so that idea of voluntary participation, it really can start to get a little bit blurred where there is a power relationship. So you should think about if this is the case and look at ways that you can avoid this happening. An example could be if you are a teacher or a lecturer, you wanted to survey your students, then instead of having you invite the participants, where you have this power relationship over them, you could get a third party. So you could have a co-researcher who is independent, doesn't know them, who can come in and they can present the research to your students. Alternatively, you could look at a different cohort who aren't your students. So if you had that third party come in, there may still be a little bit of pressure thinking, well, I want to help my teacher out. But in fact, maybe it's even better to find another cohort and who are independent of you, who don't know who you are. And that will hopefully help to reduce the chance of bias in the research as well. We should always be thinking about vulnerability in our subjects. So this could be physically, this could be psychologically, I guess it could be socially as well. Really any way in which someone could be particularly vulnerable that could make them more likely to receive some harm. So if we were doing medical research, we're looking at things like age, predisposition to illnesses, other things that could make someone vulnerable. If we're doing a study where there's some psychological element, then having warnings beforehand, having processes for people being able to seek help if there is something that does end up disturbing them. Really thinking about how we can protect participants if they happen to be vulnerable. Making sure, as I discussed earlier, that we have informed consent, we have that ability to withdraw. The type of data, is it anonymous or is it confidential? What is being recorded? Do you need to record it? There's an increasing focus on ethics and data ethics, and one of those principles that comes up, it's in a number of laws in fact in Europe, with what's called GDPR, is data minimization. So are you collecting data that actually you didn't need? So you need to be focusing on only collecting the data you need, not getting carried away. And it's hard as a researcher. My background is in statistics. I love data and models and having lots of variables, but we need to temper that with this ethical concept of only collecting what we need. We need to also think about who may have access to the data. So is it just you as a researcher? Is it a research team? Where is it going to be kept nice and secure? So this is an ethical issue around that kind of confidentiality, the identification, the privacy, which will also have legal aspects to it as well. That'll be important to check out. What are the privacy laws and the data requirements for where I live and work? cultural awareness is vital, and it can be one that is often overlooked. You should not presume to know everything about the experience of other cultures, even your own, but even more so other cultures, other groups. This could be indigenous groups, it could be other ethnic groups. There could be particular cultural property, cultural practices, things that you're not aware of, and I would always recommend getting advice on this. If there is going to be an ethnic or racial dimension to your research, then really diving deep on the appropriateness of it, of protections, of ensuring that the research is not going to have confounding variables or issues that could maybe get taken by the media and misconstrued, or could otherwise just see an unethical handling of ethnic or racial or cultural data. Okay, so as a research committee member, something I would always be looking at is any kind of bias. This could be recruitment bias. So is there bias in the recruitment? Is there any kind of coercion? If you are collecting data, sometimes, particularly as a master's student, even as a PhD student, but particularly in that kind of honours and master's level, it can be hard to collect participants, and it may be that your participants are going to be 18 to 22-year-old college-age students that happen to be at your university or college because within the 6 months or year you have to do your thesis. That's all you can collect. It's going to be a major downside of your study, and certainly this is kept in mind for ethics committees, that for an honours or a master's student, that threshold of the that recruitment is probably taken a little bit more gently. If we were looking at serious academic research with a grant or a PhD, ideally we would be going for something that is more representative. I've talked a couple of times already about poor research design, so this is certainly an ethical issue if we have insufficient sample size. Poor methodology, this could be things like confounding variables, things that aren't captured or analysed properly, transfer of findings, really anything where your methodology is going to have misleading results or being unable to get the results that you claim that you're looking for. There could be sensitive questions if you're doing a survey or a questionnaire. Maybe you're going to ask, it could be about psychological states, sexual orientation, using drugs, breaking the law. There's all sorts of sensitive things that could come up depending on your research domain. You need to think about, do you need to ask them? If you are doing a study about drug use, then obviously you do. But perhaps in amongst your survey you need to have some warnings about sensitive questions. And then I would always recommend, certainly in at least one spot, ideally before and after, some information for support services. So maybe this is counsellors, maybe in the case of, say, drugs or alcohol, it could be relevant support services for that. But actually providing some help if your sensitive questions do actually kind of trigger something in someone. It's a little bit different when it's an interview or a focus group. You still need that information, but you'll have the person there. And so if they raise an issue, you can kind of deal with it. But you need to have some mechanisms for someone who is just anonymously doing a survey if you're doing survey type research. Okay, so next thing, conflicts of interest. So are there conflicts of interest in your study, either perceived or actual? Maybe it's a sponsoring agency, maybe it's relationships between the researcher or the researcher benefiting from the outcome. These will always be very important to address. Ideally, just eliminate, not have, but certainly if they are there, the worst thing you can do is pretend that they don't exist. They're normally pretty easy for a committee to spot. And the last one that I've got, and again, as I said before, certainly not an exhaustive list here, but another one is intellectual property. So are you collecting data that could be considered intellectual property? Are you using perhaps surveys or instruments or tools that may have copyright, or they may have requirements or restrictions around usage. One that I worked on recently with someone was a psychological survey, and one of the conditions was explicitly it could not be used electronically. So making sure you are aware of things like that, and then thinking about how you can address that. So in that case, it meant that the researcher could, for that, if they were to use that survey, they were only able to do it with paper surveys, and then that limited how they were able to distribute and recruit people. And it became a trade-off. If they wanted that particular information, it was very valuable to what they were doing, then they had to adjust their study accordingly. Intellectual property can also be in the sense of kind of copyrights and images and things like that. So this section, we've looked at a number of common ethical issues. It's certainly not an exhaustive list, but hopefully it is giving you some things to think about. They may be things that come up in your study, or they may trigger you to think about other ethical things. From my time on the ethics committees, these are certainly some of the ones that came up most commonly. One last one that actually I don't have bullet pointed here, but I will mention, is researcher safety. So everything so far that we've talked about has been really thinking about research participants, but the researcher themselves, their safety is also a consideration. I did have an instance many years ago, in fact I've had a couple of times through my career, where an ethics application was either turned down or required changes because there was some high risk to the researcher. They were going to be going to extremely unsafe environments, putting themselves in a high degree of risk to collect data. In one case, it could not be resolved. They could not collect this data any other way. And the committee felt that the level of risk, the likelihood of harm to the researcher, was too great. In a couple of other cases, there was some workarounds. There was things like researchers collecting data in pairs, having kind of check-ins, having GPS to track where they are, things that helped with that safety. But that's one final issue that you should consider, is not about the participants, but about yourself as the researcher. In this final section, I have some tips for applicants. So these are things that through my own years as a researcher applying for ethics and as an advisor and a committee member, I've seen over and over again as things that I think will help make your life much easier. The first one, and one of the biggest, is to find an exemplar. So if you can find a previous application, perhaps by your supervisor or by a researcher who's studying something similar to yourself, this can really make life much, much easier, because you can get a picture of what has already been accepted, what the committee wants to see. So if you can find an exemplar to work from, and don't just copy and paste, it's very obvious when you've just copied and pasted, but really using that as the basis for your own application, it's going to make your life much, much easier. You're not going to have to worry about doing everything from scratch. You kind of can get some inspiration from this exemplar. The next is to plan ahead, and this is something that I guess as a particular PhD student you get told all the time, and you kind of nod and go, yes, of course I will plan ahead. But with an ethics application, they take time. They take time for you to complete. Getting it in the committee takes some time as well. That process of the application going to committee members, it getting read, debated at a committee, feedback back to you, this all takes time. One of the bits that people will often forget is the need to collect signatures. So these will normally need some signatures, sometimes from people that can be hard to track down. And so making sure that if the application is due by 3 p.m. on Friday, you don't wait until Friday afternoon to try and finish it and submit it and find those signatures, because there's a good chance one of those people that you need a signature from is just not going to be around. And if that delays you, that potentially on a strict committee could mean that it's another month or another 6 weeks before they sit again. So this can be a big impact on your research. The next one is to complete every box and every question. If there is a question and it does not apply to you, make sure you tick or write not applicable. If it's something where it's not applicable but you maybe need to justify it, say so. Don't leave empty boxes and things unanswered, because that is just going to be things that the committee looks at and comes back to you and says, what is your answer for this? So make sure you complete every single question in every box. In your writing, make sure you are as clear as possible. Write things as explicitly as possible. Every single step of your data collection. Don't assume that the committee will know the jargon. Don't assume that they will know all of the steps of the process you are going through. You should write as if you're writing for a layperson. So it's clear, simple language, no jargon, and very, very explicitly. And my final piece of advice is to seek advice. So if you aren't sure, check in. Often committees will have a contact person, someone you can ask questions. If you are a research student, talk to your supervisor. What advice can your supervisor give? If they're not sure, hopefully they can point you to someone who has perhaps recently done an application. They can give you some guidance as well. But really be proactive. Don't just kind of figure that you'll muddle through. If there's a cultural element, seek out the cultural advisor on campus. If there is something that's maybe a little bit unusual ethically, talk to a committee member, talk to an advisor, talk to the contact people that are there for you. This is a process that can be particularly hard and stressful for many students and many researchers. But when it's done well, it really doesn't have to be. It can add value to your research. The feedback can help you improve what you are doing. And ultimately, you end up with better research as a result. Beyond that, it's generally a legal requirement. You have to do it. So really, you want to streamline it, make it as easy as possible, not get worked up about it. Okay, so that is it for today. Hopefully you have found this advice valuable. Please make sure to share this with anyone that you think would find it useful for doing their own ethics applications, and good luck with your research. Thanks for watching this video. Please like and subscribe to support more academic content for Masters and PhD students who are embarking on their research journey. Also, see below the video for links to our YouTube, Facebook community and Skillshare.